Before going deep into this video, I want to clarify a few terms. This is, for example, a light meter. A light meter is a device that accurately and scientifically measures the intensity of the light. When I'm talking about the lumisphere, this is the lumisphere, is this white dome that covers the sensor. In some of light meters, in other light meters, you cannot detach it, but essentially you cannot mistake it. It's a white dome. This is the lumisphere, and this is kind of, let's say, will be the sensor of your light meter. Histogram. Histogram is a very small graph that you can find it on the displays of digital cameras, and it shows you the contrast in the scene. It shows you how many dark points, white points, bright points, and mid-tones points you have in the scene, but it won't tell you where are those located. Aperture is the opening in the lens. Shutter speed is the amount of time that the sensor is exposed to the light, and the ISO sensitivity of the sensor. Those are the basic terms that you're going to be using in exploring further this topic. Number 1, not calibrating the light meter with your camera lens combo. A light meter like this one and any others, unfortunately or luckily, doesn't know what camera sensor you have and what lens do you have. Apparently, the vast majority of light meters are actually calibrated for film lenses, which are using in film industry, and those are D-rated and not F-rated. Your photographic lenses are F-rated, which means that if you compare two such lenses, apparently the photographic lenses could be darker than a similar cine lens with the same aperture opening. Film cameras were made up to year 2000 or so, and for example, Canon lenses, Red Ring or whatever, EF series, for example, that works with 1V cameras, they were photographic cameras. Some of them, I don't have any Red Ring lenses, but some of them were probably, they had lower optics compared to previous models. So you have to be careful of that. Again, if you shoot film, I wouldn't worry too much about it. If you shoot digital, it's always better to calibrate because it's easier to do. Number 2 mistake is, if you're using a light meter with a digital camera, is to simply check the results given by the light meter and compare them against the histogram. Don't do that. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any camera that has a raw histogram. Most of the histogram are for JPEG. Sometimes people are using histograms, especially when they are shooting RAW, to maximize the signal, the amount of light that falls on the sensor. Now, when you are using a light meter, such a precise tool like this one and any other models, this device will simply tell you the amount of light that you have in the scene. So that amount of light won't always maximize the amount of light that your sensor is capable of capturing. Sometimes the light that exists will exceed the dynamic range of your camera. Sometimes, for example, in low contrast scene, you have much more room to play with. But each time a light meter will tell you exact the intensity of the light. So there's no need to make any further approximations unless your philosophy is to obviously expose to the right, so you can play with those details in the post-production. Number 3 mistake is when you are shooting film, to use a digital camera as a light meter. I was deliberating if I should include this or not. Though it works, you have to remember that you won't be able to use this method, for example, when you are shooting flash. A digital camera cannot simply measure the flash. The photograph needs to be taken, then you may review it on the digital screen or to the viewfinder, but you won't be able to measure the flash, so unless the flash was triggered. So it doesn't really help you. And sometimes, especially in portraiture, I wouldn't recommend to use a digital camera to get the exposure, because a digital camera most likely will protect the highlights, while in film you have to expose for the shadows. And what happens is, if you try to protect the shadows by shooting digital, you'll be immediately clipping the highlights, while in film there is so much room. So if you try to use the settings with a digital camera for film, especially for portraiture, it may not always work because of the reason that I told you. So a light meter is the key in doing this process. Number 4 in my list is using a phone app as a light meter. A phone app will essentially use the camera, the phone sensor as a light meter. It's not always accurate. You are falsely assured that the result is correct, simply because film can, especially color negative, even sometimes black and white, can provide you with a lot of room to wiggle, provided the shadows are exposed correctly. What happens is, film will initially change the contrast before it changes the brightness. Phone is made for so many things, while people from Sekonic or other companies, they are designing this device with one purpose only: to measure the intensity of the light. And obviously, as you can see, the size of the sphere, of the lumisphere, is much bigger than the size of your sensor in the phone camera. So this will definitely give much more precise option. If you think that a phone app is enough, use it. But then why are you watching these videos about light meters? It doesn't make any sense to me either. Next common mistake is placing the lumisphere in the wrong area, obviously when you are using the light meter in incident mode. You have to understand that when you are shooting film, you have to expose for the shadows. So what that means is, you have to physically dunk the lumisphere into a shadow area. If you simply going to place it, for example here, in front of the lens or towards the lens, this will average the exposure, but won't measure the shadow area, which you should do when you are shooting film. So for example, you can see that this side of the face is much brighter than the other half. So if I was shooting film, I would place the light meter here into the shadow area and excluding completely the highlights, rather than placing it here and averaging the scene. Now, if you shoot digital, is the other way around. If you shoot digital, you have to position the lumisphere into the highlights, because the highlights are burnt much easier in digital. Because if you try to do the opposite and place the light meter into the shadow area while shooting digital, you may be easily and very certainly clip the highlights, and then you'll be thinking that this device is rubbish. It's not rubbish, you just have to learn how to use it. Number 6 is a big one, and especially is used when you are using spot metering, and that is to average tones that has a similar luminosity. This is wrong. Averaging means you have to have ideally an equal number of dark tones and bright tones, rather than only dark tones or only bright tones, because if you average this, it will give you a false result. You should not average similar luminosities. If you have two pieces of white paper in front of you and you spot meter each of them, and then you average, this average is wrong. This is not the correct exposure. The way to do it is, you can spot meter any of them and then place it in the zone that you think is appropriate, like for example zone 7 or zone 8. This is how you do it. But if you have a black piece of paper or a dark material and a white material, you can spot meter both of them, average, and then that may most likely will give you the correct exposure. But don't try to average similar tones, because this is wrong. The next tip is, or the common mistake is, working hard when this device can do the hard lifting for you. Again, there's no point doing some sort of taking an exposure and then doing some sort of a weird mental math when everything can be achieved through the buttons. Like for example, if I'm taking an exposure now, I can get the correct value for the aperture and shutter speed based on the ISO that I have inputted. But if I'm not happy with the aperture, I don't have to do a mental math. I simply can press these arrows up and down, and that I'm changing the shutter speed or the aperture, and the device will calculate things for me. Similar things happens to when you average, when you try to find the contrast ratio in a scene. There are functions in your light meter that are doing this for you, that there's no point using cheat sheets or something like this. And most of the time, and most of all, is the most important thing is to trust what this device is saying to you and go with that. There's no point doing any other artificial mathematics calculations. Number 8 mistake will be mentioning Ansel Adam name and zone system when shooting digital RAW format. Would you give me a break? Digital cameras were not even invented. Even if there were when he was on the last end of his life, he did not make his work in digital RAW format, and obviously he was not a guru in Photoshop and Lightroom. Digital has a completely different system. Most of Ansel Adams' work obviously happened in the field and then finished it in the darkroom. He was also printing and developing his own photographs. Digital cameras, they shoot RAW or JPEG, whatever, and the final image will be distributed through social media or other internet applications or whatever, and people will see the result on a digital screen. Very few people these days, and this is the truth, will simply print digital photographs. So we are capturing with a digital device, and you are observing the results directly on a digital screen. What this has to do with printing? Nothing. So there's no point necessarily placing shadows in zone 3 and highlights in zone 8 when shooting digital RAW, because you can recover a huge amount of details from the shadows. So your calculations in the field are simply unnecessary. They don't need to be that precise. Most likely what you have to do is to understand how many stops you can capture above and below middle gray and work from there. But when you shoot RAW, you have to understand that this is not how the final image is going to look. So there's no point being so precise. But what you have to understand is you can use a light meter to maximize the dynamic range of your sensor, but not to use it to get the final exposure when I'm talking about digital RAW photography. There's no need for that. And that's not how it works. And we move on to the next point. And number 9 mistake is considering a light meter being an outdated tool or something that is not needed because your camera can do the same thing and blah, blah, blah. And I have seen countless YouTube videos and I read a lot of Reddit articles about it. A light meter is a device that measures the intensity of the light in a very objective way. How is this outdated? It will never be outdated. There is no other way of measuring the intensity of the light but with such a device. Now, those devices are also now included in your camera. But this device is portable. You can move it around. You can measure flash. You can designate it to do one single thing, and it does it the best. Where your camera it's programmed to do many other things. So I prefer to use it, and it's never outdated. And I hope people were still building it for many years to come from now on. Now, the last mistake that I want to talk about is not correlating the readings of the light meter with the dynamic range of your sensor or film. Again, as I was saying in the beginning, the light meter doesn't know what camera you are using, doesn't know the dynamic range of the scene. It simply tells you the intensity of the light, and you have to understand how to work with that based on your sensor capabilities. This light meter takes or assumes that you have an infinite dynamic range. And obviously this is not the case. Incident metering, it's very precise, for example, because it measures the light that falls on your scene, not the light that is reflected. But then again, won't tell you if your sensor is capable to actually capture all the tonality based on the intensity of the light that you have measured. So this is something that comes with your experience. You have to know your camera. You have to know your limitations. I would say that the best time this works in incident mode is when your subject is front lit or side lit. The most trickiest scenes are when the light is, when your subject is backlit, then the dynamic range most of the time will be exceeded. So this is a time when you have to make a intellectual judgment. But for front lit or side lit scenes, you can be very safe that with modern cameras you may capture most of the dynamic range. I hope this helps, and I see you in the next one.